everybody, my name is Miss Edwards. In this video, we are going to look at the effects of World War I at multiple scales. We are also going to focus on identifying and explaining the author's purpose by looking for extreme and absolute language. Our focus question is, how is World War I an example of total war? There are two objectives for this lesson. In this video, we are going to focus on the second objective, and our objective is to analyze World War I as a total war at multiple scales. Let's get into it. So before we jump into everything, let's quickly review the definition for the word scale.
Scale. A tool used by historians to either zoom in on a particular place or a particular period of time, or zoom out to see a larger or longer period of time.
So when we're talking about scale, we are referring to two types of scale: spatial scales and temporal scales.
When we talk about spatial scale, we have individuals, local communities, nations, regional, and the world. Temporal scale has to do with immediate, short-term, long-term effect.
For this video, we are going to focus on spatial scales. I have a few documents for us to look at, but before we dive into them, I want us to think about these words: understanding the author's purpose. When we understand the author's purpose, we understand the author's intent for their writing. What do they want us to think? What do they want us to see or feel based on what they wrote? They show us their purpose with their word choice. Let's face it, words are powerful. Words can cause us to see, feel, think, and do many different things. Authors want to convey certain meanings, so they are very strategic with their words. Let's talk about extreme and absolute language.
So authors use extreme and absolute language when they don't want to leave room for any doubt about a situation or an event. Extreme and absolute language shocks, it surprises, it can scare you, and it grabs your attention. And even sometimes there's a call to action. There are two questions that I want you to keep in mind when you find examples of extreme and absolute language in text. Why does the author use this language? And what does this language reveal about the author's purpose?
There are two ways to look for extreme and absolute language. Number one, look for the markers. Not these markers, these markers.
So let's look at some of the markers. All, always, every, everyone, never, no one, none, completely, undoubtedly, totally, disputedly, and unquestionably. Then there are the superlatives. Okay, best, worst, funniest, hardest, meanest, and saddest. So let's look at an example, a sentence that has extreme and absolute language that has markers. This was the funniest movie ever. So funniest movie ever is the example of extreme and absolute language. Was this movie funnier than others? Maybe, maybe not. But the author wants you to know that this movie was hilarious.
Number two, look beyond the markers.
Sometimes there are no markers to help you find examples of extreme and absolute language. Let's look at some examples. I haven't eaten since breakfast. I'm starving. Okay, so the extreme and absolute language is I am starving. Person had breakfast, right? So person to constitute as starving, that means they've gone days without eating, okay? So if you ate during breakfast, you're not starving, you're hungry. However, the author wants you to know how hungry the person is. Let's look at another example. The cat dive-bombed out of the tree. Okay, so the extreme and absolute language would be dive-bombed out of the tree. When you hear the word dive-bomb, you think of an aircraft, not an animal. But the author wants you to know how fast the cat got out of the tree. And then the last one, World War I was one of the worst wars of the 20th century. So there were several wars in the 20th century. However, the author wants you to know that this war had a devastating impact with mass casualties.
Let's look for examples of extreme and absolute language in our documents.
You're going to want to pause and read this text. Now that you've read the text, let's look for examples of extreme and absolute language together. This is the first one that jumped out to me. You cower alone in a hole, right? The victim of pitiless thirst for destruction, the lump of metal that will crush you into a shapeless nothing. So all of these so far, they're very vivid, right? They're very extreme. There's an emotion stirring up. There's a sadness. There's a feeling of worry when I read these things. Let's look for some more. The sea of craters dug out by machines. Every village, every tree felled, every road mined, every well fouled. Let's start to think about that question. Why does the author use this language? And what is this telling us about the author's purpose? So let's look at the first one. The first line, the first sentence, this makes me think that for the soldiers in World War I, it was a horrible and isolating way for the soldiers to die away from their loved ones. This sentence makes me think that this war was devastating because there were new weapons, right? Remember, the Industrial Revolution happened, and so there were new technologies. These weapons had some devastating consequences. There were mass casualties because of these new weapons. Okay, and now I'm seeing every, and that's a marker for me, and it makes me think that this war was devastating. This war was horrible and horrific. This war wasn't only on the battlefield. It affected local communities. So now let's apply and put all this information into our spatial skill template. What can we say about individuals? Soldiers died horrible deaths in trenches. Mass casualties. There were mass casualties because of new catastrophic weapons. War wasn't only on the battlefield. Civilians were harmed. Cities were attacked. There was heightened nationalism, and the world was dragged into war. Let's look at another example. You want to pause and read this text and come back and we'll talk about it. Now that you're back, let's look for the examples of extreme and absolute language. Haven't any money, can't buy any toys, can't get any made, never time to play, sewing shirts for soldiers nearly every day. So these are all examples of extreme and absolute language. So one thing that I also notice is they refer to soldiers marching by, right? And people waving them goodbye, right? That pulls on my heartstrings. In addition to what we already have, some other impacts on individuals would be women had to work to support work efforts. What were they doing? In the text it says they were sewing shirts for soldiers, right? Girls doing things they've never done before. We see that women were taking care of the homes, but then also going to work, which was not common at that time. For local communities and nations, we see mass mobilization of soldiers. And then industries had to create war goods instead of consumer products. We see in the text it's saying that women had to sew shirts for soldiers. So instead of producing product for people at home, they had to produce products for people in the war.
Let's recap.
So authors show their purpose by their word choice. They know which words will bring about a certain emotion, reaction from their readers, and they are strategic with the words that they use. Also, authors use extreme and absolute language to grab the reader's attention and to eliminate doubt and convey the seriousness of a topic.
Well, I hope this video helped. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Peace.